Ayaka is a cryo damage unit that has some of the most consistent cryo application in the game, with multi-targeting charge attacks, a burst that hits up to 20 times, and an elemental skill that can do damage higher than a full-built Gene Gale Blade. I know I took a long time to test out Ayaka and get you guys the most accurate information. I'm sorry it took so long, but here it is, the Ayaka build guide. In this video, we're only going to be covering the most optimal main DPS and burst DPS builds, since there are so many that work with Ayaka to get decent damage, as well as free-to-play and pay-to-play weapons, and the best team compositions. And sorry Copium Walker players, I did say viable. With all that being said, let's start with the main DPS build. First, a disclaimer because I feel like I'll get a lot of comments about this. The new Shimenawa set isn't really the best for her because a huge part of her kit is her elemental burst, and when you use the Shimenawa set, you lose burst energy and total damage in her burst, which hurts Ayaka's damage output a ton. But I'll tell you what a good set is, that is going to be the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer set. Right now, Ayaka is the only character that can take advantage of true 100% Blizzard Strayer uptime outside of Ganyu. And since her dash applies cryo and her autos are infused with cryo, it's best to take advantage of this and build 4-piece Blizzard Strayer. It is 100% undisputable best in slot for Freeze Ayaka, and it provides a ton of damage through crit rate increases and giving 15% more cryo damage. We will be talking about team compositions and how to make the most out of Blizzard Strayer on Ayaka, but for now, just know that it's her best in slot for Freeze teams. For stats on Blizzard Strayer, you're going to want to build Attack Sands, Cryo Damage Goblet, and crit damage on the Circlet, and you're always going to want to go crit damage on a Blizzard Strayer Freeze team because Blizzard Strayer is already going to give you so much crit rate that if you have even 5% crit rate substats, you're going to have more crit rate than you actually need, especially with Cryo Resonance. And then for substats, of course, you want to focus on crit damage, attack percent, and energy recharge. And crit damage, again, is just going to be huge because you get so much crit rate already from Blizzard Strayer and Cryo Resonance. But it's important not to forget that attack percent is helpful too. And energy recharge is nice because Ayaka's burst is an 80 cost. But moving on from Permafreeze, a lot of people are wondering about Melt Ayaka and the viability of Melt Ayaka, so we're going to talk about that right now. Melt Ayaka is a little weird. She has a strict 3-hit cooldown on her melt, which basically means that she can only melt a third of her burst, which makes her melt capabilities less optimal than running Blizzard Strayer for the crit rate, and also Blizzard Strayer is cheaper to build in terms of investment per crit. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that Melt Ayaka isn't viable, and I will tell you how to build her right now. If you're going to build Melt Ayaka, you have to be playing Xiangling, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the team composition section as well, but you essentially have to be playing her because Xiangling's the only character that you can reliably apply Pyro on the enemies more than Ayaka can actually apply Cryo. Essentially, this means that Xiangling will be the aura, and that Ayaka will be able to melt 1 in 3 hits. For artifacts for this set, you do want to keep running 2 Blizzard Strayer at least, but you can replace the other set with 2-piece Noblesse or 2-piece Gladiator, and that's going to help you out with getting damage even on enemies without Cryo applied. As mentioned before, Xiangling is the aura, so people are probably wondering about elemental mastery, and let me tell you, it's not worth it. Ayaka is a unit that focuses on many hits instead of one big hit, which means that accounting for her internal cooldown of 3 hits before she can melt, it's not worth using an elemental mastery sands because you're going to be losing out on a lot of potential damage whenever you're not melting, which is going to be 2 out of 3 times. But just to reiterate, if you are going to run Melt Ayaka, you want 2 Blizzard Strayer and 2 Noblesse, or 2 Blizzard Strayer and 2 Gladiator, and you can use the Shimenawa 2-piece set to replace Gladiator, though I feel like a lot of people probably have 2 good Gladiator pieces by now, and if not, there is the artifact exchange, though I doubt anyone's going to use that for Gladiator. So for main stats, it does end up being the same thing as Blizzard Strayer, with an attack sands, cryo damage goblet, and crit damage circlet, although you can actually go crit rate with Melt Ayaka because you won't have the bonus crit rate from Blizzard Strayer. So essentially, if you need more crit rate, try to shoot for the 40-80 ratio and beyond, so the 1-2 crit rate to crit damage ratio. And for substats, it's more of the same. You want crit rate, crit damage, attack percent, and energy recharge. Elemental mastery is a little bit better than it was before, but still not super necessary. But now that we've talked about 2 big main DPS options for Ayaka, we're going to talk about burst DPS options as well, because her burst does do a ridiculous amount of damage. Funny enough, if you are building Ayaka as a burst DPS, the best build ends up being basically the same as main DPS, where the best set is to use Blizzard Strayer 4-piece with the same stats, because 20 to 40 crit rate and cryo damage bonus are kind of huge. There are other options as well, and we'll talk about those, as well as the main stats for her artifacts. In order to get more damage on her burst, you can actually use 2 Blizzard Strayer, 2 Gladiators, or 2 Blizzard Strayer and 2 Noblesse. The 2 Noblesse option will actually get you more damage than Gladiators will, but it does come down to a difference of substats as well. So if you have insane Gladiator substats, but you don't have any Noblesse with good substats, then go for the 2 Gladiator, 2 Blizzard Strayer. And one final option that you have is the new set Emblem of Severed Fate. So there's been lots of talk about how this set is good and what it's good for. Essentially, the set can replace any kind of elemental damage bonus and Noblesse set and bump out more burst damage and more energy recharge. So the good things about this set is that it has a really strong burst DPS potential, and it gives you a little bit more energy recharge. However, it does lose out on skill and auto attack attack damage, which is something that Ayaka actually benefits from a lot. One quick point of clarification that I want to make is that I don't actually recommend using energy recharge sands on her because attack sands gives you more total kit damage overall, and there's great cryo batteries like Diona to make sure that she gets her burst quickly, though it is really worth focusing on ER substats. So if you have any good ER substat pieces that fit into the emblem set, they could be super beneficial while you're able to maintain your damage for the most part. So to sum up stats for burst DPS, you do want to focus on attack percent sands, cryo damage goblet, and crit rate or crit damage circlet, depending on what you need. If you're running the Blizzard Strayer set, you don't need a crit rate circlet, and for substats, you do want to focus on crit damage, crit rate, energy recharge, and attack percent. And I would actually say that energy recharge probably takes precedent over crit sometimes, and attack all the time for burst DPS. If you're trying to think about whether or not to use Blizzard Strayer or Emblem of Severed Fate, you can think about it this way. Emblem of Severed Fate is going to get you more bursts in a shorter amount of time. However, Blizzard Strayer or 2-piece Blizzard 2-piece Noblesse is going to get you the highest burst damage in general. I do just want to say though, while you can focus on her as a burst DPS, she has so much potential in the rest of her kit that I feel like it's kind of a waste to put her on the bench. Her burst is a majority of the damage in her kit, but she can get a lot of value by being out on the field as well, so I'd recommend making her main DPS over burst DPS, but you can play how you want. Anyways, that's about it for the artifact builds, but we're going to talk about weapons now so that you guys know what to use. We'll start off with free-to-play weapons, and then we'll talk about some pay-to-play stuff. For free-to-play, your best option is going to be the Blackcliff Sword because it builds crit damage, which works well with the idea of Cryo Resonance and Blizzard Strayer. It's available to free-to-play players in the shop on a monthly rotation, so if you save up Star Glitter, you should be able to get one. If as a free-to-play you bought Bennett Constellations in the shop instead, you can complete the Sakura Cleansing Ritual and Farmer's Treasure Quest to get the new craftable sword blueprint, which I'm not able to correctly pronounce, but that sword is super solid because it gives you a ton of energy after you use your burst, and it builds an attack percent main stat. So I highly recommend those two swords. However, we do have some other options as well. So for non-free-to-plays or for people who have other options or for whales, Mist Splitter Reforged is best in slot because of the 2 stacks you'll always be able to have up on Ayaka, and it builds a crit damage main stat. It is undisputable best in slot for Ayaka. Jade Cutter is technically the second best, but it's really only worth building if you can turn your crit rate substats into crit damage or if you've been playing Melt Ayaka, because you're going to have way more crit rate than you need and probably less crit damage than you're going to want if you use Jade Cutter in a freeze comp. However, the bonus attack you get from Jade Cutter does make it worth using in general. Summit Shaper is actually a really great option for her even without shield, though if you're running this, I'd recommend building Diona as a shield bot for Cryo Resonance and a shield buff. That way you're able to get the most out of Summit Shaper. It is a solid resource. And then for free-to-plays, if you are using 3 stars, Harbinger of Dawn is great, especially if you can keep her above 90% HP and get that thing to R5. It will put out a ton of damage. I'm not going to go over every single weapon, but here's the weapon spreadsheet that was referenced from Ayaka mains if you guys want to see how other weapons stack up. This isn't necessarily a power rating, but it does show where weapons stack up against each other, so that way you guys can get a general idea of how good they are in comparison. So now that we've gone over weapons for Ayaka, we can talk about teams, and teams are probably the most important thing when you're playing Ayaka outside of, main stats on artifacts. There's 2 main teams I want to talk about, which is a freeze team and a melt team. So the freeze team is going to take Ayaka, a hydro character usually like Xingqiu, a cryo battery like Kaya or Diona, and a support of choice, which is usually a Viridescent Venerer Swirler or a grouping character. If you're free to play and you don't have Xingqiu, you might be unsure of what to do. I just want to point out that Mona and Barbara are also decent in freeze teams as well, since Barbara can apply Hydro in contact with the enemy, and Mona's able to put out Hydro ticks with her taunt. But essentially, you're just going to use Xingqiu and Ayaka together to make sure that enemies freeze. You can use Kaya if you want to have extra cryo uptime, and I mostly just use Diona for shields and heals. That's why I prefer her over Kaya. And for the 4th slot, you can really just run any support. You can run Bennett in the 4th slot if you want, but I found that I prefer to run Bennett on a Pyro Resonance team, which is usually my other Abyss team. For free to play, you guys should look into Sucrose as a grouping tool because Sucrose is really good and kind of underrated still. And Albedo, Kazuha, and Venti also all fit into the last slot extremely well. Venti especially because you can hit lifted enemies with Ayaka's skill and burst, so these really synergize well together. And of course, Viridescent Venerer is just always a good set. I also just want to point out that if you know what the Morgana team comp is, where it has Mona, Ganyu, Diona, and Venti, you can actually replace Ganyu with Ayaka and still get a ton of value out of that team. I'll have a video on Morgana later on, so make sure to be subscribed if you want to see that later. Next up, we'll talk about Melt. So essentially, you're going to want to run Ayaka, Xiangling, who is free to play, so you absolutely should run her, Bennett, and a support of your choice, which again, I like to Viridescent Venerer Swirl. I feel like that's the best way to use my characters, and because most Anemo characters have a grouping tool, except for Xiao, who has a separating tool. But if you don't have Bennett, this team becomes much less strong, since Bennett can be a decent battery for Xiangling, and Xiangling really needs that battery, because you want Xiangling's ult up at all times possible. But essentially, whenever you have Xiangling's ult up, and if you throw out Guoba as well, you're going to be melting with Ayaka. You'll only be getting the 1.5 times multiplier because it's a reverse melt. However, you will be increasing Ayaka's damage by a lot, so that's going to be nice. And again, in the 4th slot, I just really think that Viridescent Venera and grouping tools are really nice, except you can use Zhongli or Albedo as well for shields, and that'll be really helpful for you. The thing is, though I prefer to have shields and heals on a freeze team, you don't necessarily need them as much on a freeze team because you're constantly freezing the enemy. However, on a melt team, enemies aren't getting frozen, so you will want to make sure that you have healer or shield. And that's about it. This should be all you need to know about building Ayaka. And for all this information, I made sure to cross-reference info from Ayaka mains. Their link will be in the description and pinned comment, so make sure to go check them out if you want to see theory crafting and stuff. Make sure to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed or if this helped you at all. And once again, I am live on Twitch a few days a week at twitch.tv/Braxaphone if you want to see live testing and gameplay. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will catch you later.